The millionaire abandoned her husband and baby. 25 years later, she froze when she saw him with a young woman identical to her in a luxury restaurant. She approached. Clara Bennett sat at her usual table in the corner of Le Chateau, one of New York City's most exclusive restaurants. The soft golden light from the crystal chandeliers above reflected off the polished silverware, and the hum of quiet conversations filled the air. For most, this place was the pinnacle of luxury and status. For Clara, it was routine. She pushed her half-eaten steak around her plate with a fork, her appetite dulled by the weight of her thoughts. Around her, couples laughed softly, business deals were whispered, and glasses clinked in celebration. Clara sat alone, as she often did, with only the distant buzz of her phone for company. It was a life many envied, but tonight, it felt hollow. Her eyes wandered across the room as she sipped her wine, the rich burgundy liquid leaving a faint stain on her lips. That's when she saw him, James Carter. For a moment, her breath caught in her throat. It had been over 2 decades, but there was no mistaking him. His shoulders were broader now, his hair streaked with gray, but his presence was as commanding as ever. He sat at a table not far from hers, leaning slightly forward as he spoke to the young woman across from him. Clara's gaze shifted to the woman, and her heart nearly stopped. The girl was strikingly familiar. Her sharp cheekbones, almond-shaped eyes, and the slight tilt of her chin mirrored Clara's own face in her youth. The world seemed to blur at the edges as Clara clutched the stem of her glass. Was it possible? Could this young woman be? Her legs moved before her mind could catch up, and within moments, Clara was standing at their table. Both James and the girl looked up, startled by her sudden appearance. "James," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to sound composed. "It's been a long time." James's eyes hardened as he leaned back in his chair. His expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the chill in his tone when he replied, "Clara, I didn't expect to see you here." Clara's gaze darted to the young woman, who was now studying her with cautious curiosity. "And you must be—" "This is Emily," James said curtly, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "My daughter." Clara felt the words hit her like a physical blow. Emily, her daughter, the child she had left behind 25 years ago, now grown into a poised, confident young woman. Emily's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked between Clara and her father. "I'm sorry," she said, her tone polite but distant. "Do we know each other?" Clara swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Emily," she began, her voice softer now. I'm your—" "She's an old acquaintance," James interrupted, his tone sharp enough to halt Clara mid-sentence. "Someone I used to know a long time ago." Emily frowned but didn't press further. Clara stood frozen, unsure of what to say or do next. The tension at the table was palpable, and for the first time in years, she felt completely out of control. "James, please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can we talk privately?" "There's nothing to talk about, Clara," James replied, his tone unwavering. "Enjoy your evening." Clara hesitated, her eyes lingering on Emily, who now looked more confused than ever. "It was nice to meet you, Emily," she said finally, her voice trembling as she turned and walked away. Back at her table, Clara stared blankly at her plate, her appetite completely gone. Her mind raced with memories she had buried for years, memories of the day she left, the look on James's face as she walked out the door, and the tiny cries of a baby she never held again. The waiter approached, asking if everything was all right, but Clara waved him off. Her thoughts were too chaotic to focus on anything else. She had spent years convincing herself that leaving was the right choice, that building her empire was worth the sacrifices. But tonight, seeing Emily and James together, the cracks in that justification felt impossible to ignore. As she sat in the dim glow of the restaurant, Clara made a decision. She couldn't let this be the end of it. She had to find a way to talk to Emily, to explain, to make her understand why she had done what she did. For the first time in years, Clara felt something stir inside her, something more than ambition or pride. It was hope, fragile and flickering, but enough to ignite a spark of determination. She wasn't sure how, but she would find a way to bridge the chasm she had created so long ago. As the evening wound down and the restaurant emptied, Clara remained seated, her mind racing with plans and possibilities. Somewhere across the city, her daughter existed, her flesh and blood, and Clara knew she couldn't let this chance slip away. Clara sat in the back seat of her sleek black car as it weaved through the glowing streets of New York City. Outside, the hum of city life was relentless. Honking cabs, flashing billboards, and bustling crowds moving with purpose. Yet, none of it registered in Clara's mind. Her thoughts were trapped in an endless loop, replaying the encounter at the restaurant over and over again. James, Emily. The names echoed in her head like a mantra. Each repetition digging deeper into wounds she thought had long healed. The look in James's eyes, cold and unyielding, cut her to the core. And Emily, her daughter Clara, still couldn't believe how much she resembled her younger self. Yet there was a fire in Emily's gaze that was entirely her own. "Ma'am, are you all right?" her driver asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. Clara startled slightly, realizing she had been gripping her purse so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice lacked its usual composure. "Just take me home." The car pulled up to her penthouse, a towering skyscraper that glistened like a jewel against the night sky. Clara stepped into the private elevator, the silence inside a sharp contrast to the chaos in her mind. As the doors slid open to reveal her impeccably designed living space, she was struck by how empty it all felt. The marble floors gleamed under the soft glow of chandeliers, and the view of the city from the floor-to-ceiling windows was breathtaking. But tonight, it was all meaningless. For years, this penthouse had been a symbol of her success, a tangible reminder of everything she had achieved. Now, it felt like a gilded cage. Clara sank into the plush couch in her living room, her designer heels clicking against the floor as she kicked them off. She stared at the skyline, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. For the first time in years, she felt small. She reached for her phone, her fingers hesitating over James's name in her contacts. It had been over 2 decades since she last called him, and the weight of that realization made her stomach churn. She couldn't bring herself to press the button. Instead, Clara opened the internet browser on her phone and typed Emily Carter. She wasn't sure what she expected to find. Maybe a social media profile or a news article. But the search results revealed very little. Emily seemed to be a private person, unlike Clara, whose name was splashed across countless business publications. Frustrated, Clara tossed her phone onto the coffee table. She ran her fingers through her perfectly styled hair, unraveling it as she leaned back against the couch. A knock on the door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Clara frowned. It was almost midnight. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, she found herself face to face with her personal assistant, Olivia, who held a folder in her hands. "Miss Bennett, I know it's late, but I thought you'd want this immediately," Olivia said, her tone professional but tinged with concern. Clara nodded and stepped aside, allowing Olivia to enter. She gestured toward the couch, and Olivia hesitated before taking a seat. "This just came in from the team handling your upcoming charity gala," Olivia began, handing Clara the folder. "They finalized the guest list and the media arrangements." Clara opened the folder. Skimming through the contents, normally, she would have dissected every detail with precision, but tonight, her mind couldn't focus. "Thank you, Olivia," she said, closing the folder and setting it aside. "I'll review this tomorrow." Olivia hesitated, her usually composed expression softening. "Ms. Bennett, are you sure you're all right? You seem distracted." Clara forced a smile. "I'm fine, just a long day." Olivia didn't press further, but as she stood to leave, she added, "If there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to call, even if it's late." Clara nodded, and as Olivia walked out, the weight of the evening returned in full force. She glanced at the folder again, but instead of opening it, she stood and walked to her bedroom. The room was just as lavish as the rest of the penthouse, with a king-sized bed, silk sheets, and a walk-in closet that could rival a boutique. Clara sat at her vanity, her reflection staring back at her. For the first time in years, she didn't recognize the woman in the mirror. She thought about Emily, her smile, her inquisitive eyes, the way she carried herself with such confidence. Clara felt an ache in her chest as she realized just how much she had missed. Birthdays, first days of school, milestones. She had missed it all. Reaching for the small drawer on the vanity, Clara pulled out an old photo. It was of her and James on their wedding day, a moment frozen in time when everything seemed possible. Clara traced her finger over the image, her throat tightening with emotion. The phone on her bedside table buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She grabbed it quickly, her heart leaping when she saw an unfamiliar number. Could it be James or Emily? Her hope was dashed when she answered and heard the voice of a colleague discussing details about an upcoming deal. Clara ended the call as quickly as politeness allowed, tossing the phone aside once more. That night, as Clara lay in bed, sleep eluded her. The memories of her past mixed with the possibilities of the future, creating a storm in her mind. She couldn't change what she had done, but she could decide what to do next. Clara made a silent vow to herself. She would not let this chance slip away. She would find a way to connect with Emily, no matter how much resistance she faced. Tomorrow, she would begin again. Clara woke up to the faint rays of morning sunlight streaming through the massive windows of her penthouse. The city below was already alive. The sounds of honking taxis and distant chatter filtering into her room. But for Clara, the morning brought little solace. She hadn't slept much, her mind preoccupied with the encounter at the restaurant and the undeniable truth. She had seen her daughter for the first time in 25 years, sitting at the edge of her bed. Clara stared at the floor, her thoughts racing. She knew she couldn't undo the past, but the desire to explain herself, to make Emily understand, burned within her. She couldn't just leave things as they were. Determined, Clara reached for a shoebox hidden in the back of her walk-in closet. It was worn and dusty, a stark contrast to the pristine luxury that surrounded her. Inside were fragments of a life she had tried to bury, old photographs, letters, and keepsakes from a time when her world revolved around love, not ambition. She picked up a picture of James holding a tiny, swaddled Emily. His expression was one of pure joy, a look she hadn't seen since those early days. Clara's heart ached as she traced her finger over Emily's tiny face. How could she explain to her daughter that leaving her was the hardest decision she had ever made? Her thoughts drifted to the moment that had changed everything. She had been young and naive, deeply in love with James. Despite her father's disapproval, her father, Henry Bennett, was a ruthless businessman who had built his empire on control and intimidation. He had made it clear from the start that James, with his humble upbringing and modest aspirations, would never be good enough for his daughter. Clara could still hear her father's cold, commanding voice in her mind. "You think love is enough, Clara? Let me show you how quickly it can be destroyed." The threats had started subtly. James losing job opportunities, strange men lingering near their apartment. Then, one day, Henry had laid out his ultimatum. "Leave him and the child or I'll destroy them both. You know I can." At the time, Clara had been paralyzed by fear. She had convinced herself that leaving was the only way to protect James and Emily, though the decision had shattered her. Over the years, she had built a fortress around her heart, channeling her pain into her work, and convincing herself that she had made the right choice. But now, seeing Emily and James together, had reopened wounds she thought had long healed. The life she had tried to forget was staring her in the face, and she couldn't run from it any longer. Clara placed the photo back in the box and stood, her resolve strengthening. She had spent years hiding behind the walls of her success, but it was time to confront the past. That afternoon, Clara found herself standing outside a small cafe in Brooklyn. It was a charming place with brick walls, ivy-covered windows, and a steady stream of patrons coming and going. She had learned through some light research that Emily often stopped here after work. Clara's palms were sweaty as she clutched her designer handbag. For someone who had closed billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, the prospect of speaking to her own daughter was unnervingly daunting when Emily finally appeared. Clara's breath caught. She was even more striking in daylight, confident, poised, and entirely her own person. Emily wore a fitted blazer and carried a leather satchel, her expression focused as she scrolled through her phone. Clara hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. "Emily," she said softly. Emily looked up, her brow furrowing as she recognized the woman who had approached her and James the night before. "Miss Bennett," she said, her tone formal and distant. "Please, call me Clara," she replied, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "I was hoping we could talk." Emily's lips tightened into a thin line. "About what?" "About everything," Clara said, her tone pleading. I know I don't deserve your time, but there's so much I need to explain. Emily sighed, glancing at her watch. I have a meeting in an hour, she said, her voice tinged with impatience. Make it quick. Clara gestured to a nearby table, and they both sat down. For a moment, Clara struggled to find the right words. How could she condense decades of regret and longing into a single conversation? I know I hurt you, Clara began, her voice barely above a whisper. And I know I can't undo what I did, but I want you to understand why I made the choices I made. Emily crossed her arms, her expression guarded. You abandoned us. What else is there to explain? It wasn't that simple, Clara said, her voice breaking slightly. I was young, and I made mistakes, but I didn't leave because I didn't love you. I left because I thought it was the only way to keep you safe. Emily's eyes narrowed. Safe from what? Clara hesitated, the weight of her father's threats pressing down on her. From my family, she admitted finally. My father was not a good man. He would have destroyed your father's life, and yours, if I stayed. Emily stared at her, disbelief and confusion flickering across her face. So, you're saying you left us out of love? Clara nodded. I know it sounds absurd, but yes, I thought I was protecting you, and I've regretted that decision every single day since. Emily didn't respond immediately. Her expression remained unreadable, but Clara could see the turmoil in her eyes. You could have come back, Emily said finally, her voice trembling. You could have fought for us. Clara swallowed hard. I know, and I'll never forgive myself for not being stronger. But I'm here now, Emily. I'm here because I want to make things right, if you'll let me. The cafe grew quieter as Clara's words hung in the air. Emily stared at her, her emotions a storm of anger, pain, and reluctant curiosity. I need time, Emily said at last, standing up and grabbing her bag. I don't know if I can do this. Clara watched her walk away, her heart heavy but hopeful. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. And for now, that was enough. Clara couldn't focus on anything else after her brief conversation with Emily. It had taken every ounce of courage she possessed to approach her daughter, and though the encounter had ended with Emily walking away, it had also left Clara with a glimmer of hope. Emily hadn't shut the door entirely, and that was enough to keep her determined. Sitting at her desk later that evening, Clara stared at the stack of reports that demanded her attention. She was supposed to be reviewing projections for a major real estate acquisition, but the numbers blurred together, meaningless compared to the weight of her personal mission. Her assistant, Olivia, knocked on the door and entered cautiously. Mrs. Bennett, the investors are expecting your feedback by tomorrow morning. Do you need any assistance? Clara blinked, snapping out of her thoughts. She forced a small smile. No thank you, Olivia. I'll take care of it tonight. Olivia nodded but hesitated. If I may, you've seemed preoccupied these past few days. Is everything all right? Clara paused, then waved a hand dismissively. It's personal, she said, her tone softer than usual. But thank you for asking. Once Olivia left, Clara leaned back in her chair, exhaling deeply. She wasn't used to this kind of emotional vulnerability. For years, she had built walls around herself, presenting an image of unshakable confidence and control. Now, those walls felt like they were crumbling, and Clara wasn't sure how to handle the cracks. Her thoughts turned back to Emily. How could she reach her? How could she show her daughter that she wasn't the same person who had walked away all those years ago? Clara reached for her phone and stared at Emily's number. She had managed to find it through discreet channels, but calling felt too intrusive. Instead, she opened her messaging app and hesitated before typing. Emily, thank you for meeting me today. I know I don't deserve your time, but I'm grateful for it. I hope we can talk again soon. There's so much I want to share with you. She read the message over several times before pressing send. A few seconds later, the message was marked as delivered, but not read. Clara sighed, placing the phone down on her desk. She knew better than to expect an immediate response. The next morning, Clara woke up to find no reply from Emily. Disappointment settled in her chest, but she pushed it aside. If she wanted to reconnect with her daughter, she needed to be patient. After her morning coffee, Clara decided to take a more deliberate approach. She went to her bedroom closet and retrieved the shoebox of memories she had opened the night before. Inside, she found a small, delicate bracelet, a silver chain adorned with a single charm shaped like a star. Clara remembered the day she had bought it. It was meant to be a gift for Emily's first birthday, but by then, she had already left. She had kept it all these years, a painful reminder of what she had missed. Carefully, Clara placed the bracelet in a velvet-lined box and wrote a short note. "Emily, I thought you might like this. It was meant for you a long time ago. I hope we can talk again soon." She sealed the package and arranged for it to be delivered to Emily's office. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a step forward. Later that afternoon, Emily sat at her desk, flipping through a stack of legal documents. She had barely slept the night before, her mind replaying the conversation with Clara. Despite her lingering anger, she couldn't shake the look in her mother's eyes, the raw pain and regret that seemed so genuine. When her assistant entered with a small package, Emily frowned. "What's this?" "There's no sender listed, but it's addressed to you," the assistant replied, setting the package on Emily's desk before leaving. Emily opened the box cautiously, her eyes widening when she saw the bracelet. She held it up, the charm catching the light, and noticed the note tucked inside as she read Clara's words. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over her. She wanted to dismiss the gesture as manipulative, but a part of her couldn't ignore the sincerity behind it. She set the bracelet down and stared at it for a long time. That evening, Clara was sitting in her living room nursing a glass of wine when her phone buzzed. Her heart jumped when she saw Emily's name on the screen. The message was brief. "I received the package. Thank you." Clara reread the words several times, a small smile tugging at her lips. It wasn't much, but it was progress. She decided to reply carefully. "I'm glad you got it. I'd love to meet again whenever you're ready." Emily's response didn't come immediately, and Clara didn't expect it to. She was learning to take things one step at a time. The next few days passed slowly. Clara buried herself in work during the day, but found her thoughts drifting to Emily constantly. Finally, on a quiet Thursday evening, her phone buzzed again. This time, Emily's message was longer. "I've been thinking about what you said. I'm not ready to forgive you, but I think we should talk again. Let me know when you're available." Clara's hands trembled slightly as she typed her reply. "Thank you, Emily. I'll make time whenever you're free. Just say the word." Emily's response was almost immediate. "Tomorrow, 6 p.m. The same cafe." Clara exhaled a shaky breath, her heart pounding. She had another chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. As she prepared for the next meeting, Clara felt a mix of nervousness and determination. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was moving towards something that truly mattered. The cafe was busier than usual when Clara arrived the next evening. The warm smell of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods filled the air, but Clara barely noticed. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on Emily, who was sitting by the window, absently stirring her drink. Clara hesitated for a moment, smoothing her skirt and taking a deep breath before walking over. "Emily," she said softly, a tentative smile on her face. Emily glanced up, her expression neutral but guarded. "You're on time," she said, motioning to the chair across from her. "I didn't want to waste a second," Clara replied, sitting down and folding her hands on the table. She studied her daughter, marveling at the way Emily carried herself. She was composed, her sharp eyes betraying a quiet intelligence. It was like looking into a mirror of her younger self, yet Emily's demeanor was entirely her own. For a moment, they sat in silence, the hum of the cafe filling the space between them. Clara finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me again. I wasn't sure if you would," Emily shrugged, her gaze fixed on her cup. "I figured I might as well hear what you have to say, but don't mistake this for forgiveness." Clara nodded, her throat tightening. "I understand. I don't expect you to forgive me, Emily. Not yet, but I'm grateful for the chance to talk." Emily leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "All right then, talk." Clara paused, collecting her thoughts. "I know I've said this before, but I want you to know how deeply sorry I am for leaving. I thought about you every single day, wondering if you were happy, if you were safe, and I know that's not enough. It will never be enough. But I need you to understand that I didn't leave because I didn't care." Emily's jaw tightened. "You keep saying that, but it doesn't change the fact that you abandoned us. Do you know what it was like growing up without a mother? watching Dad struggle to do everything on his own? Clara winced at the anger in Emily's voice, but she forced herself to hold her daughter's gaze. I can't imagine how hard it was for you and your father. But Emily, I truly believed I was protecting you. Emily scoffed. Protecting us? From what, yourself? Clara hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. She had avoided telling Emily the full story, fearing it would sound like an excuse. But now she realized she had no choice. My father, Clara began, her voice trembling slightly. He was a very powerful man, and he didn't approve of my relationship with your father. He thought James wasn't good enough for me. He wanted me to marry someone who fit into his world. Emily's eyes narrowed. So, you left us because of your father's disapproval. That doesn't sound like protection to me. It wasn't just disapproval, Clara said quickly. He threatened James. He threatened you. He told me that if I stayed, he would ruin James's life, take away his job, his reputation, and you. Clara's voice broke. He said he'd make sure you didn't have a future. I didn't know what he was capable of, but I couldn't take the risk, so I left. Emily stared at her, a mix of disbelief and anger flashing across her face. You expect me to believe that you left because you were trying to protect us. I know how it sounds, Clara said, her voice pleading, and I know I should have found another way, but I was young and scared. I thought leaving was the only way to keep you safe. Emily shook her head, her expression hardening. You had options, Clara. You could have fought for us. Instead, you chose the easy way out. You abandoned us and built your perfect little life while Dad and I had to figure everything out on our own. Clara's eyes filled with tears. You're right. I should have fought harder. I should have stayed, but Emily, please believe me when I say that I never stopped loving you. Leaving was the hardest thing I've ever done. Emily looked away, her jaw clenched. For a moment, the anger in her eyes wavered, replaced by something softer, something vulnerable. But just as quickly, the walls went back up. I don't know if I can believe you, Emily said finally. I don't know if I even want to. Clara nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. I understand, and I won't force you to believe me. But I'm here now, Emily, and I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I mean every word. Emily didn't respond right away. She stared out the window, her fingers drumming against the edge of the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, almost resigned. I don't know what you expect from me. I've spent my whole life wondering why you left, hating you for it, and now you're here, telling me it was all to protect us. It's too much. I don't expect anything from you, Clara said gently. I just want the chance to make things right. Whatever that looks like, I'll take it. Emily looked at her, her eyes searching Clara's face as if trying to gauge her sincerity. We'll see, she said finally, standing up and grabbing her bag. But don't get your hopes up. Clara nodded, her heart aching as she watched Emily walk away. It wasn't the resolution she had hoped for, but it was a step forward, and for now, that was enough. As Clara sat alone in the cafe, she made a silent vow. No matter how long it took, she would keep fighting for her daughter. Clara spent the next few days obsessing over every detail of her conversation with Emily. She replayed it in her mind, scrutinizing her daughter's words, expressions, and tone for any hint of progress. While Emily hadn't outright rejected her, the emotional walls between them were as high as ever, and Clara knew she would have to be patient. Her determination, however, was unwavering. Clara wasn't the type to back down from a challenge, especially one as important as this. Winning back her daughter's trust wouldn't be easy, but she was prepared to do whatever it took on a crisp Saturday morning. Clara found herself in her office, flipping through a stack of old photographs she had unearthed from the shoebox in her closet. There was one of Emily as a baby, her tiny hand gripping James's finger, another of James grinning as he held Emily up to touch the leaves of a tree. Clara's chest tightened as she stared at the images. Overwhelmed by a mixture of nostalgia and regret, her assistant Olivia knocked softly on the door, peeking inside. Ms. Bennett? Your 10 a.m. appointment has been rescheduled. Is there anything else you need? Clara glanced up, realizing she had been lost in thought. Actually, yes, she said, gesturing for Olivia to enter. I need you to arrange a delivery, Clara continued, her voice resolute. Something personal. That afternoon, Emily sat at her desk, poring over a stack of paperwork. Her office was small but tidy, with a few personal touches. An orchid on the windowsill, a framed photo of her and James on a hiking trip. The calm ambiance was interrupted by a knock on the door. "Come in," Emily called, not looking up. Her assistant entered holding a small, neatly wrapped package. "This just came for you," she said, setting it on Emily's desk. Emily frowned. Her curiosity piqued. She untied the ribbon and opened the box to reveal an old photo album. Flipping it open, she found pages filled with pictures she didn't recognize. Images of James holding her as a baby, her first birthday party, and candid moments from her childhood that she had no memory of. Tucked inside the front cover was a note written in Clara's elegant handwriting. "Emily, I found these photos recently and thought you might like to see them. Your father captured so many beautiful moments, and I wanted to share them with you. Clara." Emily's initial reaction was skepticism. She set the album aside and tried to refocus on her work, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the photographs. Against her better judgment, she flipped through the album again later that evening. Seeing her childhood through those images stirred something unexpected in her. It reminded her of the joy she had shared with her father, but it also filled her with questions about the mother who had missed it all. A few days later, Emily sent a text to Clara. "Thank you for the album. It was unexpected." Clara read the message at least 5 times, a small smile spreading across her face. She immediately replied, "I'm glad you liked it. I'd love to hear your thoughts whenever you're ready." Emily didn't respond, but Clara knew better than to push. She decided to take a step back and let Emily come to her when she felt ready. Meanwhile, James had been quietly observing the situation from the sidelines. Emily had mentioned the meetings with Clara in passing, her tone dripping with skepticism, but James could tell she was conflicted. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching TV, James turned to Emily. "How are things going with your mother?" Emily paused, fiddling with the hem of her sweater. "I don't know," she admitted. "She's trying, I guess. She sent me some old photos the other day." James raised an eyebrow. "Photos?" "Yeah, of us. Me as a baby." James nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "She kept them all these years." "I guess so," Emily said, shrugging. "It doesn't change anything, though. She still left." James hesitated before responding. "People make mistakes, Emily. Sometimes big ones. But it sounds like she's trying to make amends." Emily turned to him, surprised by his tone. "You're defending her now." "I'm not defending her," James clarified. "But I'm saying that maybe it's worth giving her a chance. If she's sincere, you might regret not hearing her out." Emily didn't respond, her thoughts swirling. The next weekend, Clara was surprised to receive a call from Emily. "Hi," Emily said awkwardly. "Do you have time to meet tomorrow? There's something I want to talk about." Clara's heart leapt. "Of course," she said quickly. "Just tell me when and where." "The cafe. Noon," Emily replied. Clara spent the rest of the evening preparing herself, her nerves buzzing with anticipation. She knew this was another opportunity to bridge the gap between them, and she was determined not to waste it. When they met at the cafe the next day, Emily seemed less guarded than before. She sipped her coffee and leaned back in her chair, her demeanor more relaxed. "I looked through the album," Emily said, breaking the silence. Clara smiled gently. "And?" Emily hesitated. "It was nice. I didn't realize Dad had taken so many pictures. He was always so proud of you," Clara said softly. "He wanted to capture every moment." Emily nodded, her expression contemplative. "It made me think about what you said. About why you left?" Clara's heart raced. She leaned forward, her tone careful. "And?" Emily met her gaze, her voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "I'm not saying I forgive you. Not yet, but maybe I'm willing to try." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back, nodding. "That's all I could ever ask for." The air at the cafe felt lighter that day. Clara sat across from Emily, who seemed less guarded than before. For the first time since their initial encounter, Clara felt a sliver of hope that the walls Emily had built might be starting to crack. Emily stirred her coffee absent-mindedly, her gaze fixed on the swirling liquid. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began hesitantly. Clara straightened in her chair, her heart beating faster. "I'm listening," she said, careful not to sound too eager. Emily looked up, meeting her mother's eyes. You said you left because you thought it would protect us. I'm trying to understand that, but it's hard. You talk about threats, about Grandpa. But what exactly happened? I need to know everything. Clara's stomach churned. She had anticipated this moment, but wasn't sure she was ready to revisit the darkest parts of her past. Still, if this was what Emily needed, she would do it. Emily, Clara began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. I've spent years trying to block out those memories, but I owe you the truth. You deserve to know. Emily leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Then start from the beginning. Clara took a deep breath. Your grandfather, Henry Bennett, was a complicated man. He was powerful, respected, and feared by almost everyone who knew him. To the outside world, he was a brilliant businessman, but behind closed doors, he was controlling and ruthless. He believed in legacy, in maintaining a certain image, and he thought love was a distraction from ambition. Emily's expression tightened. So, when you met Dad, Clara nodded. When I met your father, Henry was furious. James wasn't from the same world we came from. He didn't have the connections, the money, or the pedigree that Henry thought I deserved. But I didn't care about any of that. I loved your father for who he was. Kind, hardworking, and genuine. A faint smile touched Clara's lips as she recalled those early days. We were happy, Emily. We didn't have much, but we had each other. And that was enough. At least it was until Henry found out. Emily frowned, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. What did he do? Clara's expression darkened. At first, he tried to bribe James to leave me when that didn't work. He started sabotaging him. James lost job opportunities. Business deals fell through. And strange men started following us around. It was Henry's way of sending a message. Emily's jaw tightened. And you just let him. Clara shook her head. I didn't know what to do. I thought we could endure it. But then Henry made it clear that he wasn't just bluffing. He came to me one day and said that if I didn't leave James, he would destroy him. And he didn't stop there. Clara's voice faltered as she continued. He said he would take you away from us. He had the money, the connections, and the power to do it. I believed him, Emily. I believed he would ruin your father's life and take you from me. Emily's eyes widened, her disbelief evident. So, you left us to save us. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. I know how it sounds, and I know I should have stayed and fought, but I was young and scared, and I thought I was doing what was best. I thought if I left, Henry would stop his threats and leave you and your father alone. Emily stared at her, a storm of emotions swirling in her expression. Anger, sadness, and perhaps the faintest glimmer of understanding. Did he? Emily asked quietly. Did he stop? Clara hesitated, guilt tightening her chest. For the most part, yes. Your father managed to rebuild his life without interference, and you grew up safe. But it came at a cost, Emily. I lost everything that mattered to me. Emily's voice trembled as she asked, Why didn't you ever come back? I wanted to, Clara said, her voice breaking. Every single day I wanted to. But by the time I felt strong enough to face Henry, years had passed. I thought you and your father were better off without me. I told myself that staying away was the least I could do to make up for the damage I'd caused. Emily's eyes filled with tears, and she quickly wiped them away. You don't get to decide what was best for us, Clara. You don't get to walk away and then expect us to understand. I know, Clara said softly, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want you to know that I've carried the weight of that decision every day of my life. I never stopped loving you, Emily, not for a second. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the cafe seemed distant as they sat in silence, both grappling with the raw emotions that had been laid bare. Finally, Emily exhaled shakily. I need time to process all of this. It's a lot. Clara nodded, her heart aching but hopeful. Take all the time you need. I'll be here whenever you're ready. Emily stood, slinging her bag over her shoulder. She hesitated for a moment, then said, Thank you for telling me the truth. Clara watched her leave, the bittersweet moment lingering in the air. She had opened the door to her past, and while she didn't know what the future held, she felt a sense of relief, For the first time in decades, she had told Emily everything. Now, all she could do was wait and hope. Days passed after Clara's heart-wrenching conversation with Emily, and the silence that followed was both agonizing and expected. Clara busied herself with work. Though her thoughts were never far from her daughter, she had finally told Emily the truth, a truth she had buried for so long that speaking it aloud felt like reopening an old wound. Still, there was a glimmer of hope. Emily hadn't rejected her outright. She had said, "Thank you for telling me the truth," and that was enough for Clara to cling to. Meanwhile, Emily was grappling with the revelations she had heard. The story Clara had told her didn't erase the pain of abandonment, but it added layers of complexity to her feelings. She had spent her whole life believing her mother had left because she didn't care. Now, the truth painted a different picture, one of fear, manipulation, and sacrifice. Sitting in her apartment one evening, Emily stared at the bracelet Clara had sent her, the charm catching the light as it dangled from her fingers. Next to it on the table was the photo album, its pages still half turned from the night she had flipped through them. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from her father. "James, dinner tomorrow, 7 p.m. Your favorite place." Emily smiled at the text. Her father had always known how to lift her spirits. She quickly typed back, "Sure, looking forward to it." The next evening, Emily and James met at a cozy Italian restaurant they had been frequenting for years. The smell of garlic and fresh bread filled the air as they sat in their usual booth near the window. James studied his daughter as she picked at her pasta, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. "All right, Em," he said, setting down his fork. "What's on your mind?" Emily looked up, startled. "What?" "Nothing. I'm fine." James raised an eyebrow. "You're a terrible liar. You know that." Emily sighed, leaning back in her chair. "It's about Mom. I met with her again." James's expression softened, though his jaw tightened slightly. "And how did that go?" "She told me the truth," Emily said, her voice quieter. "About why she left. About Grandpa." James's grip on his glass tightened, but he remained silent, waiting for her to continue. "She said he threatened you. Threatened me," Emily added. "She thought leaving was the only way to protect us." James exhaled deeply, his eyes darkening. "Your grandfather was a complicated man," he said carefully, "and he was more than capable of carrying out those threats." "So it's true?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. James nodded. "I didn't know the full extent of it at the time, but yes, your mother wasn't lying." Emily stared at her father, her thoughts spinning. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" James hesitated. "Because I didn't want you to hate her for something that wasn't entirely her fault. I was angry at her, yes, but I knew she was trying to protect us in her own way. I didn't want to taint your memories of her with all that ugliness." Emily's chest tightened. She had spent so many years resenting her mother, yet here was her father, admitting that he had tried to shield her from the full truth. "She could have come back," Emily said after a moment. "She could have," James agreed. "But you have to understand, Emily. She was in a no-win situation. She made a choice, one I didn't agree with, but I believe she thought it was the right thing to do at the time." Emily sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know what to think anymore. Part of me wants to keep hating her, but another part of me doesn't." James reached across the table, placing a hand over hers. "It's okay to feel conflicted. No one's asking you to forgive her overnight. Take your time and do what feels right for you." Later that week, Emily found herself scrolling through old photos on her phone. She stopped at a picture of her and James on her college graduation day. He had been her rock through every milestone, and the thought of what they had endured because of her grandfather's cruelty made her heart ache. She opened her messaging app and typed a quick text to Clara. "Are you free this weekend? I think we need to talk again." The response came almost immediately. "Of course, just tell me when and where." Emily hesitated for a moment before replying. "Saturday afternoon, same cafe." When Saturday arrived, Clara was already waiting at the cafe when Emily walked in. She stood as Emily approached, her nervousness evident in the way she smoothed her skirt. "Hi," Clara said, her voice soft but warm. "Hi," Emily replied, sitting down across from her. They ordered drinks, and for a moment, there was silence as they settled into their seats. Finally, Emily broke the tension. I've been thinking a lot about what you told me. About everything, Clara nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. And, Emily exhaled, her expression conflicted. I'm not saying I'm ready to forgive you, but I think I want to try to understand you better. I want to know more about everything. Your life, what happened after you left. All of it. Clara's eyes softened, a flicker of hope lighting up her face. I'll tell you anything you want to know, Emily. No more secrets. Emily hesitated, then asked, Do you regret it, leaving us? Clara's voice trembled as she replied, Every single day. For the first time, Emily saw a crack in the armor Clara had so carefully constructed. She saw the vulnerability, the regret, and the love that had been buried beneath years of distance and misunderstanding. All right, Emily said quietly. Let's start there. Clara arrived at the cafe early again, her nerves making it impossible to sit still. She had spent the morning preparing herself, replaying potential questions Emily might ask and rehearsing honest answers. This time, she hadn't brought anything tangible. No gifts, no old photos. Today, it would be just her words. When Emily walked in, Clara immediately noticed a subtle shift in her demeanor. Emily's steps were measured, her expression less guarded. It wasn't warmth exactly, but it wasn't the icy indifference Clara had seen in their first meetings either. Hi, Emily said simply as she sat down. Hi, Clara replied, offering a small, tentative smile. A server approached, and they placed their orders. Coffee for Clara, tea for Emily. As soon as the server walked away, Emily leaned forward, her expression serious. I've been thinking a lot about everything you told me, Emily began, her voice steady. About Grandpa, about your decision to leave, and how it all fits into my life. Clara nodded, waiting for her to continue. I'm still angry, Emily admitted, her tone firm. And I don't know if that's going to change anytime soon, but I also don't want to keep walking around with all this resentment. It's exhausting. Clara's chest tightened at her daughter's honesty. I can't tell you how much I regret the pain I've caused you, she said softly. I know it'll take time, but I'm here, Emily, for as long as it takes. Emily studied her for a moment before responding. Then start by telling me about your life after you left. What did you do? How did you go from everything with Grandpa to where you are now? Clara took a deep breath, her hands resting on the table. After I left your father and you, I went straight to my father's house. I told him I'd done what he wanted, that I'd ended things with James. He didn't even look surprised. It was as if he knew he'd already won. Emily frowned, her fingers tightening around her teacup. For a while, I felt completely lost, Clara continued. I threw myself into work because it was the only thing I could control. My father gave me a position in his company, and I worked harder than anyone else, hoping it would drown out the guilt. Did it? Emily asked bluntly. Clara shook her head. No, the guilt never went away. If anything, it grew worse. Every time I saw a mother with her child, or heard someone talk about their family, I thought of you and James. But I kept telling myself that I had made the right decision, even if it didn't feel that way. Emily leaned back in her chair, her gaze unwavering. And then what? You built this empire, and that was supposed to make everything better. No, Clara admitted, her voice trembling slightly. The success was a distraction, nothing more. I thought that if I became powerful enough, if I achieved enough, it would somehow make up for what I'd done, but it didn't. All the wealth, all the accolades, they never filled the void. Emily's expression softened. Just a fraction. So why now, after all these years? Why reach out now? Because seeing you and James at the restaurant shook me, Clara said honestly. I've spent so much of my life trying to move forward, but the moment I saw you both, I realized how much I had been running from. I don't want to run anymore. Emily, I want to try to make things right, even if it's too late. Emily was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. You said Grandpa gave you a job. Did you ever confront him about what he did? About the threats? Clara hesitated, then shook her head. I wish I could say I did, but I didn't. He was a force of nature. Even as an adult, I felt powerless against him. By the time I found the strength to stand up to him, he was gone. Gone? Emily asked, her eyebrows raising. He died about 10 years ago, Clara explained. Heart attack. It was sudden. We hadn't spoken in years by that point. Emily processed this silently, her expression unreadable. Did he ever apologize? Did he ever acknowledge what he did? No, Clara said softly. He never admitted any wrongdoing. He believed he was protecting the family legacy, and nothing else mattered to him. Emily sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. It's so messed up. All of it, Clara nodded. It is. And I hate that his actions cause so much pain. Not just to me, but to you and your father as well. If I could go back and change things, I would. But all I can do now is try to move forward and be a part of your life, if you'll let me. Emily met her mother's eyes, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something that resembled understanding. I don't know what that looks like yet, she admitted, but maybe we can figure it out. Clara's heart swelled, but she kept her response measured. One step at a time, she said gently. Whatever pace you're comfortable with. The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that. Emily's job, her favorite places in the city, and the hiking trips she used to take with James. As the minutes turned into hours, Clara felt a small but significant shift in their dynamic. When they finally left the cafe, Emily turned to Clara before walking away. I'll let you know when I'm ready to meet again, she said. Clara smiled. I'll be waiting. As she watched her daughter disappear into the crowd, Clara felt a sense of cautious optimism. For the first time in years, she believed that reconciliation was truly possible. Clara woke up the next morning feeling lighter than she had in years. The conversation with Emily at the cafe had been far from perfect. But it was progress. For the first time, Emily seemed genuinely open to exploring the possibility of a relationship, and Clara was determined not to let this chance slip away. As she prepared her coffee in the quiet of her penthouse, Clara allowed herself a rare moment of optimism. She could still hear Emily's words. Maybe we can figure it out. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. Clara sipped her coffee and opened her laptop, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She began typing an email, pausing every few seconds to make sure her tone was just right. Subject: a small step. Dear Emily, thank you for meeting me yesterday. It meant more to me than I can express. I know we still have a long way to go, but I'm grateful for the chance to take this journey with you, even if it's just one step at a time. If you're open to it, I'd like to do something together. Something small, no pressure. Let me know if there's a time or place that works for you. Yours, Clara. After rereading the email several times, Clara hit send and leaned back in her chair. She knew Emily might take her time responding, but she felt a sense of relief just putting the invitation out there. Emily saw the email later that afternoon while scrolling through her phone on a lunch break. She read it twice, her emotions flickering between hesitation and curiosity. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to let Clara wait and wonder. But another part of her, the part that had started to see Clara as more than just a source of pain, felt compelled to reply, subject, a small step, Clara, small step. Thanks for the email. I appreciate what you said. I'm free on Saturday morning if you want to meet at the park near my apartment. It's usually quiet and I like to walk there on weekends. Let me know if that works for you. Emily Clara's response was nearly immediate. Subject, a small step that sounds perfect. I'll see you there at 10. By the time Saturday rolled around, Clara had meticulously planned everything. She dressed in casual but elegant attire, opting for a comfortable pair of flats instead of her usual heels. She wanted to blend in, to show Emily that she could step out of her world of luxury and meet her on common ground. The park was serene that morning, the autumn leaves casting a warm golden glow over the walking paths. Clara arrived early, clutching a small tote bag she had packed with a few thoughtful items, just in case the opportunity arose to share something meaningful. When Emily arrived, she looked relaxed in a simple hoodie and jeans, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She greeted Clara with a nod, her expression neutral but not unkind. Good morning, Clara said, smiling warmly. Morning, Emily replied. They started walking, falling into a quiet rhythm as they strolled along the winding paths. Birds chirped in the trees, and the crisp air carried the faint scent of fallen leaves. So, Emily said after a while, breaking the silence, you're not exactly a walk-in-the-park kind of person, are you? Clara chuckled softly. Not usually, but I'll admit, this is nice, peaceful, Emily glanced at her, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "It's my favorite spot to clear my head. Dad and I used to come here when I was a kid." Clara's heart ached at the mention of James. She could picture him walking these same paths with a younger Emily, holding her hand, pointing out squirrels and colorful leaves. It was a world Clara had never been part of, and the realization stung. "It's beautiful," Clara said sincerely. "I can see why you love it." They walked a bit further before Emily stopped and gestured toward a bench. "Let's sit for a minute." Clara followed her, carefully sitting down and setting the tote bag at her feet. Emily leaned back, her gaze fixed on a group of children playing nearby. "Do you ever think about what it would have been like if you'd stayed?" Emily asked suddenly, her tone contemplative rather than accusatory. "All the time," Clara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I imagine the birthdays I missed, the school plays, the everyday moments. I've wondered how different things might have been if I had been braver, if I had stayed and fought for us." Emily glanced at her, her expression unreadable. "And what do you imagine?" Clara hesitated before replying. "I imagine being there for you, watching you grow up, celebrating your achievements, comforting you when things got tough. I imagine us being a family." Emily nodded slowly, her gaze returning to the children. "It's hard to imagine you as part of that. For so long, it was just me and Dad." "I know," Clara said softly, "and I can never replace what you had with him. But I'd like to try to be part of your life now, if you'll let me." Emily didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached down and picked up a stray leaf, turning it over in her hands. "What's in the bag?" she asked, changing the subject. Clara smiled faintly, grateful for the shift in tone. "Just a few things I thought you might like." She opened the tote and pulled out a small journal. "I found this in my old things," Clara explained. "It's one of the journals I used to keep when I first started working for my father. I wrote about everything. Work, my struggles, even my regrets, I thought. Maybe you'd want to read it someday." Emily took the journal hesitantly, running her fingers over the worn leather cover. "Thanks," she said quietly. They sat in silence for a while longer, the journal resting in Emily's lap. Eventually, she stood, tucking it into her bag. "I should get going," Emily said. Clara nodded, rising to her feet. "Thank you for today, Emily. It means a lot to me." Emily gave a small nod, her expression softer than before. "I'll let you know when I'm ready to meet again." As Clara watched her daughter walk away, she felt a flicker of hope growing stronger. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, she felt like they were truly moving forward. Step by step, Clara hadn't been able to stop thinking about the walk in the park. It wasn't just the setting, with its crisp air and autumn leaves. It was the feeling of progress, the sense that Emily was beginning to lower her guard. The sight of her daughter holding the journal had lingered in Clara's mind like a faint light at the end of a long, dark tunnel. For the next few days, Clara focused on giving Emily space. She resisted the urge to send texts or emails, knowing that every step forward had to come at Emily's pace. But her resolve to be part of her daughter's life only deepened. Meanwhile, Emily sat at her apartment one evening, staring at the journal Clara had given her. She hadn't opened it yet, unsure if she was ready to dive into her mother's past. It felt heavy in her hands, like it carried not just Clara's words but years of pain and unanswered questions. Finally, with a deep breath, she flipped it open to the first page. August 15th. "I've been at my father's company for 6 months now, and every day feels like a balancing act. I work harder than anyone else, hoping to prove myself, but it never seems to be enough. Father is demanding, relentless, and I'm always one mistake away from disappointing him. I think about James and Emily constantly. Sometimes I see their faces in my dreams, and it hurts more than I can put into words. I tell myself this sacrifice was for them, that they're safer without me. But there are moments when I wonder if I made the biggest mistake of my life." Emily's heart clenched as she read the words. She flipped through a few more pages, skimming entries that chronicled Clara's relentless work schedule, her struggles to meet her father's expectations, and the regret that seeped into every corner of her life. One entry stopped her cold. November 22nd. "It's Emily's second birthday today. I spent the morning thinking about what kind of cake she would have, what presents James might give her. I should be there with them. But instead, I'm here in this cold, empty apartment, pretending that my absence doesn't matter. Father called this morning to remind me that my focus should be on the company. He said I need to stop living in the past. But how can I? How can I move forward when the best part of my life is behind me? Emily closed the journal, tears welling in her eyes. For so long, she had believed that Clara had walked away without a second thought. But the words in the journal painted a different picture, one of a woman trapped by fear, regret, and an overwhelming sense of duty. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking her thoughts. It was a text from her father, James. "How's your evening going?" Emily stared at the screen, her emotions swirling. Finally, she typed back, "Fine, just reading something Mom gave me." The response came quickly. "Do you want to talk about it?" Emily hesitated, then replied, "Maybe tomorrow. Can we grab dinner?" The next evening, James and Emily met at their usual Italian restaurant. Emily was quieter than usual, pushing her food around her plate as James watched her with concern. "All right," James said finally. "What's on your mind?" Emily set down her fork and sighed. "I read some of Mom's journal, the one she gave me during our walk." James's eyebrows raised in surprise. "And how was that?" "It was intense," Emily admitted. "There's a lot in there about how much she regretted leaving us, about how hard things were for her, working for Grandpa." James nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Your grandfather was a tough man, tougher than most people realized, and I think a lot of what he put her through shaped the decisions she made." Emily looked at her father, her voice soft. "Do you believe her, Dad? Do you believe she really left because she thought she was protecting us?" James paused, choosing his words carefully. "I believe she loved you, Emily, and I believe she thought she was doing what was best, even if I didn't agree with it." Emily frowned, her fingers tracing the edge of her plate. "It's hard to let go of the anger, you know. It's been part of me for so long." "I know," James said gently. "But holding on to that anger doesn't hurt anyone but you. If you're ready, maybe it's time to let some of it go." Emily sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I don't know if I'm ready yet, but I think I want to try." James smiled, his eyes filled with quiet pride. That's all anyone can ask for. The following week, Emily texted Clara again. "I finished reading the journal. Can we meet?" Clara's response came quickly. "Of course. Name the time and place." When they met at a small cafe downtown, Emily placed the journal on the table between them. "I read it," she said simply. Clara's heart raced. "And?" Emily took a deep breath. "It was hard to read, seeing how much you struggled, how much you regretted leaving. It was a lot, but it also made me see you differently." Clara's voice trembled as she replied, "I'm glad you read it. I wanted you to know how much you've always meant to me, even when I wasn't there." Emily nodded, her gaze steady. "I'm not ready to forgive you completely, but I'm starting to understand, and maybe that's a start." Clara smiled through her tears, her voice soft. "It's more than I could have hoped for." For the first time, Emily smiled back. Clara couldn't help but replay Emily's words in her mind as she sat in the back seat of her car on the way home. "I'm starting to understand." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the closest they had come to bridging the gap that had kept them apart for so long. For the first time, Clara allowed herself to feel a cautious optimism, a hope that perhaps she hadn't lost everything. Emily, meanwhile, felt the weight of her emotions as she walked back to her apartment. The journal had given her a window into her mother's life, one she hadn't expected, one she wasn't sure she had wanted. It complicated everything she thought she knew. And while the anger she had carried for years wasn't gone, it had shifted. She couldn't ignore the sincerity in Clara's words, or the raw pain that leapt off the pages of the journal. She settled onto her couch, her fingers absently scrolling through her phone. Though she wasn't paying attention, her thoughts drifted back to James, the steady anchor in her life who had always been there to pick up the pieces. She knew he had his own feelings about Clara, feelings he rarely shared fully. With a deep breath, she dialed his number. "Hey, kid," James greeted warmly. "Hey, Dad," Emily said, her voice quieter than usual. "You have a minute?" "Always," James replied without hesitation. "I met with Mom again today," Emily began, unsure of how to navigate the conversation. James paused. "And how did it go?" Emily hesitated. "Better, I think. I told her I'm not ready to forgive her, but I'm starting to understand why she did what she did. The journal helped." "I'm glad to hear that," James said softly. I don't know where this is going, Emily admitted. Part of me still wants to keep my distance. But the other part of me feels like maybe it's time to give her a chance. James was silent for a moment before speaking. Emily, you've spent your whole life being strong, carrying a lot of weight on your shoulders. It's okay to let some of that go. And if giving Clara a chance feels like the right thing to do, then trust yourself. You're allowed to want that. Emily smiled faintly, the warmth in her father's words giving her the reassurance she didn't realize she needed. Thanks, Dad. Anytime, kid, James replied. You've got this. The next morning, Clara sat in her living room, sipping her coffee as the city buzzed outside her windows. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she quickly reached for it, her heart leaping when she saw Emily's name. Emily, I was thinking about visiting Dad's house this weekend. Maybe you could come too. Clara stared at the message, her mind racing. She hadn't been to James's house in over 25 years. The thought of stepping into that space again filled her with equal parts anxiety and hope. But the fact that Emily had extended the invitation felt like a significant step forward. She typed her response carefully. I'd like that. Let me know when and I'll be there. Emily replied quickly. Saturday at 2. See you then. Saturday arrived, and Clara found herself standing outside James's modest but inviting home. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where kids played in front yards and neighbors waved to each other from porches. It was a stark contrast to the sleek, impersonal skyscrapers she had grown accustomed to. As she walked up the path to the front door, her heart pounded in her chest. She knocked lightly, and moments later, the door swung open to reveal Emily. Hey, Emily said, stepping aside to let Clara in. Hi, Clara replied, her voice soft. The interior of the house was warm and welcoming, filled with photos and personal touches that spoke to a life well lived. Clara's eyes lingered on a framed picture of Emily and James at a beach, both of them grinning broadly. Mom, Emily said, drawing Clara's attention back. Dad's in the kitchen. Come on. Clara followed her daughter down the hall, the familiar layout triggering memories she hadn't revisited in years. When they reached the kitchen, James turned from the stove, a wooden spoon in hand. Clara, he greeted, his tone neutral but not unkind. James, Clara replied, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. For a moment, the air was thick with unspoken words, but Emily quickly broke the tension. Dad's making his famous lasagna, she said with a small smile. Famous? Huh, Clara said lightly, her lips twitching into a faint smile. Don't let her fool you, James said, chuckling. It's just lasagna, but it gets the job done. Emily rolled her eyes playfully. It's good. Just take the compliment. As James returned to the stove, Clara glanced around the kitchen, noting the small but meaningful details. The recipe book propped open on the counter, the magnets on the fridge holding up photos and notes, the worn but cozy chairs around the dining table. Can I help with anything? Clara asked. James hesitated before nodding toward the salad ingredients on the counter. You can chop the vegetables if you want. Clara moved to the counter, rolling up her sleeves and picking up a knife. The three of them worked in relative silence, the clatter of utensils and the soft hum of the stove filling the room. As they sat down to eat, the conversation was tentative at first, but gradually it grew easier. Emily shared stories about her work. James chimed in with anecdotes about their neighbors, and Clara listened intently, occasionally sharing pieces of her own life. By the end of the meal, the atmosphere was lighter. Clara felt a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced in decades. As they cleared the table, Emily turned to her. Thanks for coming today, she said quietly. Clara met her daughter's gaze, her voice filled with emotion. Thank you for inviting me. James, standing nearby, watched the exchange with a mixture of curiosity and cautious hope. For the first time, he wondered if it might truly be possible for the three of them to find a way forward, together. The warm scent of lasagna lingered in the air long after the plates had been cleared. James had stepped out to answer a call, leaving Clara and Emily alone in the kitchen. The quiet felt significant, but not uncomfortable. It was a kind of silence that Clara had long hoped to share with her daughter, unforced and natural, the way it should have been all along. Emily stood by the sink, rinsing the last of the dishes. Clara moved to dry them, the rhythmic sound of water and cloth filling the room. For a moment, they worked side by side. No words exchanged, just the simplicity of a shared task. Dad hasn't let anyone else in the kitchen while he's cooking in years, Emily said suddenly, her tone light but tinged with meaning. Clara smiled faintly, sensing the significance of Emily's words. I suppose that's a good sign then. Emily shrugged, but the corners of her mouth twitched upward. He's cautious when it comes to you. I think he wants to see where this goes, just like I do. Clara set down the plate she was drying, her heart aching at the vulnerability in Emily's voice. I don't blame either of you for being cautious, she said gently. After everything I've put you through, it's only fair. Emily looked at her for a long moment, as though weighing her next words. I'm trying, Mom. It's hard, but I'm trying. Clara reached out hesitantly, placing a hand on Emily's arm. That's all I could ever ask for, she said softly. Emily nodded, her gaze dropping back to the sink. Clara withdrew her hand, sensing that the moment, while small, was another step forward. Later, they moved to the living room, where James had already settled into his armchair. Clara perched on the edge of the couch, feeling a strange mix of nostalgia and unfamiliarity. This was a space she had once imagined herself in, a family room filled with warmth and connection. Now she was a guest, treading carefully on sacred ground. James cleared his throat, breaking the silence. So, Clara, he began, his tone casual but probing, what's next for you? Are you planning to stay in New York for a while? Clara glanced at Emily, then back at James. I am, she said, her voice steady. I've stepped back from some of my work commitments to focus on other priorities. James arched an eyebrow. Other priorities. Clara met his gaze directly. Emily is my priority now, she said simply. Emily, who had been scrolling through her phone, froze at the words. She looked up, her expression unreadable. I know it'll take time, Clara continued, addressing both of them. But I want to be here for her. In whatever way she'll let me, I want to rebuild what I lost. James leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. It's a noble goal, he said after a pause. But are you ready for how hard that might be? I'm ready for whatever it takes, Clara replied without hesitation. Emily shifted in her seat, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of a pillow. It's not just about showing up now, she said quietly. It's about proving that this isn't temporary, that you're not going to disappear again when things get hard. Clara's breath caught at the raw honesty in Emily's voice. She nodded, her tone firm. I won't disappear, Emily. Not this time, I promise. The evening stretched on, and the conversation gradually turned lighter. James shared stories from Emily's childhood, her first attempt at riding a bike, the time she insisted on adopting a stray cat, and her surprisingly fierce soccer skills. Clara soaked it all in, laughing and smiling as she pieced together the parts of Emily's life she had missed. Emily, despite her initial reservations, found herself opening up as well. She shared anecdotes about her work and hobbies, even recounting the time she and her best friend got lost on a hiking trip, but managed to find their way back using a hand-drawn map. Clara listened intently, her heart swelling with pride and sadness all at once. Each story was a reminder of the years she had missed, but also a glimpse of the strong, resilient woman Emily had become. As the clock ticked past 9, James stood and stretched. I think that's my cue to call it a night, he said with a chuckle. Emily nodded, rising from the couch. I should probably head home too. Clara followed suit, gathering her things as James walked them to the door. As they stepped outside, the cool evening air greeted them, crisp and refreshing. Thanks for coming, Clara, James said, his tone genuine but measured. Thank you for having me, Clara replied, meeting his gaze. Emily lingered for a moment, looking between her parents. We should do this again, she said, her voice quieter than usual. Clara's heart leapt at the suggestion. I'd like that, she said softly. James nodded, his expression thoughtful. We'll see what we can arrange. As Clara climbed into her car, she glanced back at the house, watching as Emily and James disappeared inside. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of belonging, not fully realized, but tangible enough to give her hope. Back inside, James turned to Emily as she set her bag down by the door. So, he said, his tone light. What did you think? Emily sighed, leaning against the wall. It wasn't as awkward as I thought it would be, she admitted. James chuckled. That's high praise coming from you. Emily smiled faintly, then added, "I think she's really trying, Dad. I don't know if I'm ready to trust her completely, but it feels different this time." James nodded, placing a hand on her shoulder. "That's all you can ask for, kid. One step at a time." Emily looked thoughtful as she climbed the stairs to her room, her mind filled with memories of the evening. For the first time, she began to wonder if rebuilding a relationship with her mother might be worth the risk. The days that followed were quieter, but they carried a subtle shift in the air. Emily continued her routine, going to work and spending evenings with friends or her father. Yet, something about her felt lighter, as though the weight of years of unresolved anger had begun to lift. Clara, too, found herself approaching life differently. For the first time in years, her focus wasn't on corporate meetings or financial reports. It was on Emily. She spent her days carefully considering how to connect with her daughter without overstepping, balancing her eagerness with the caution she knew was necessary. It was Emily who broke the silence first. Late one evening, Clara's phone buzzed with a text. "Emily, Dad's birthday is next weekend. I'm planning a small dinner at his house. If you're free, you should come." Clara stared at the message, her heart pounding. The invitation felt monumental, a sign that Emily was truly beginning to let her in. She quickly typed a reply. "Clara, I'd love to. Let me know if there's anything I can bring." Emily's response came quickly. "Just yourself. 7 p.m., Saturday." The following week passed in a blur of nervous anticipation. Clara wanted to make the evening special, but she also didn't want to overdo it. She settled on a thoughtful gift for James, a first-edition copy of one of his favorite novels, which she had tracked down with some effort. By the time Saturday arrived, Clara felt a mix of excitement and anxiety as she stood outside James's home once again. She held the wrapped book tightly, her mind racing with what-ifs. When Emily opened the door, her expression was warm but reserved. "Hey, Mom, come in." Clara stepped inside, immediately struck by the cozy atmosphere. The living room was decorated with a few balloons and a simple banner that read, "Happy birthday, Dad." A table in the dining room was set for 3, adorned with a small vase of flowers. "Wow," Clara said, smiling. "This looks lovely." Emily shrugged, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Dad doesn't like big celebrations, so I kept it simple." "It's perfect," Clara said sincerely. James appeared from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. His expression registered brief surprise at seeing Clara before he nodded in greeting. "Clara," he said, "glad you could make it. Thank you for having me," Clara replied, offering the wrapped book. "Happy birthday, James." James took the gift, his eyebrows lifting in curiosity as he unwrapped it. When he saw the book, his eyes softened. "A first edition," he said, running his fingers over the cover. "How did you even find this?" Clara smiled. "A lot of phone calls and a little luck." James chuckled. "It's a thoughtful gift, thank you." Emily watched the exchange silently, a small flicker of hope stirring within her. Seeing her parents interact like this, cordial, even kind, was unfamiliar but oddly comforting. Dinner was a surprisingly pleasant affair. Emily had cooked James's favorite meal, and they all fell into an easy rhythm of conversation. James shared stories from his younger years, some of which made Emily laugh so hard she nearly spilled her drink. Clara mostly listened, interjecting occasionally to ask questions or share her own anecdotes. She was careful not to dominate the conversation, aware of the fragile balance they were building. As they moved to the living room for dessert, Emily excused herself briefly to take a call. Clara and James were left alone, the silence between them comfortable but weighted. "Emily seems happier," Clara said tentatively. James nodded, his gaze fixed on the birthday card Emily had given him. "She's been carrying a lot for a long time. I think letting some of it go has been good for her." Clara hesitated before speaking again. "I can't thank you enough for how you've raised her, James. She's an incredible person, and that's because of you." James looked at her, his expression softening. "She's incredible because she's strong. She's made her own choices, just like you and I did." Clara nodded, her chest tightening. "I still regret the choices I made, every day." James studied her for a moment, then sighed. "Regret doesn't change the past, Clara, but maybe you're finally doing what you can to make things right." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled deep within Clara. When Emily returned, they cut into a small chocolate cake she had made herself. The light-hearted banter resumed, and for a brief moment, Clara allowed herself to feel as though she were part of something she had long thought lost. As the evening wound down, Emily walked Clara to the door while James cleaned up in the kitchen. "Thanks for coming tonight," Emily said, her voice quiet. "Thank you for inviting me," Clara replied. "It meant a lot to be here." Emily hesitated, then added, "I think Dad was glad you came too, even if he doesn't say it outright." Clara smiled faintly. "That means a lot to me." Emily shifted on her feet, her expression thoughtful. "You know, this is the first time in a long time that it's felt normal, like a family." Clara's breath caught at the admission, her chest swelling with emotion. "That's all I've ever wanted," she said softly. Emily nodded, her gaze steady. "We're not there yet, but maybe we're getting closer." Clara reached out and lightly squeezed Emily's hand. "One step at a time," she said. Emily didn't pull away, and for Clara, that small gesture was everything. As Clara drove home that night, her heart was full. She replayed the evening in her mind, savoring every moment. It hadn't been perfect, but it had been real. And that, she realized, was all she could ask for. For the first time in years, she felt like she was truly part of a family again. The events of James's birthday dinner lingered in Clara's mind for days, leaving her feeling both hopeful and cautious. While it was clear that the evening had been a step forward, she knew that trust and forgiveness weren't earned overnight. It was a delicate balance. One misstep could undo everything. For Emily, the dinner had stirred emotions she hadn't fully processed, seeing her parents share quiet moments of understanding, even after so many years of separation, made her wonder if reconciliation was possible. It was a thought that both comforted and frightened her. That weekend, Emily decided to visit the park again, needing the solace of its winding paths and crisp air to clear her head as she walked. Her thoughts drifted back to the journal her mother had given her, the stories her father had shared, and the quiet sincerity in Clara's eyes at dinner. A part of Emily still clung to the anger she had carried for years. It was familiar, like an old scar that had healed, but never disappeared. Letting it go felt like losing a piece of herself, even if that piece was a painful one. She sat on a bench, watching a group of children playing tag in the distance. Their laughter was light and carefree, a stark contrast to the heaviness she felt. Emily sighed, pulling out her phone and scrolling through her contacts. Her thumb hovered over Clara's name before she finally pressed call. Clara answered on the second ring, her voice warm but cautious. "Emily, hi." "Hi," Emily said, fidgeting with the hem of her jacket. "Do you have time to meet? I'm at the park, and I thought..." She trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. "I can be there in 20 minutes, Clara said immediately. Emily nodded, even though her mother couldn't see her. "Okay, I'll wait." When Clara arrived, she spotted Emily sitting on a bench near the fountain. She approached slowly, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. "Hi," Clara said, sitting down beside her. "Hi," Emily replied, her gaze fixed on the fountain. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the park filled the silence, the rustling leaves, distant laughter, and the rhythmic splash of the fountain. Finally, Emily broke the stillness. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," she began. "About you, about Dad, about what it means to forgive someone." Clara remained quiet, sensing that Emily needed to get her thoughts out. "It's not easy," Emily continued, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I've spent most of my life being angry at you. It was easier than trying to understand. But now I see things differently." Clara swallowed the lump in her throat. "I don't expect forgiveness, Emily. I never have. I just want the chance to show you that I'm here for you now." Emily turned to look at her, her expression conflicted. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about moving forward, right?" Clara nodded, her voice soft. "That's what I've always believed." Emily hesitated, then said, "I'm not ready to say I forgive you, but I don't want to hold on to the anger anymore. It's exhausting, and it's not who I want to be." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "That means more to me than you could ever know." They sat in silence for a while, the tension between them slowly giving way to something softer. Later, as they walked through the park together, Clara took a deep breath and said, "There's something I want to share with you, if you're ready to hear it." Emily glanced at her, curious. "What is it?" Clara stopped walking and turned to face her. "It's about your grandfather. There's more to the story than I told you before." Emily's brow furrowed, but she nodded for her mother to continue. "When I left, it wasn't just because of his threats," Clara admitted, her voice trembling. "It was because I didn't believe I could stand up to him. He had this way of making me feel powerless, like nothing I did would ever be enough. I thought leaving was the only way to protect you and your father. But looking back, I think I also left because I was afraid." Emily's expression softened. "Afraid of what?" "Afraid of failing," Clara said quietly. "Afraid that if I stayed, I wouldn't be strong enough to fight him, and that fear has haunted me ever since." Emily looked at her mother, seeing her in a new light. For so long, she had viewed Clara as cold and unfeeling, but now she saw the cracks in that facade, the vulnerability that Clara had worked so hard to hide. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," Emily said softly. Clara smiled faintly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you, Emily, that means more than you know." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, they found themselves sitting on another bench, their conversation flowing more easily now. Clara shared stories from her childhood, her voice tinged with nostalgia and regret. Emily listened intently, occasionally asking questions or sharing her own memories. For the first time, it felt like they were truly connecting, not as strangers trying to rebuild something broken, but as a mother and daughter beginning to understand each other. When they finally parted ways, Emily hugged Clara, a brief but genuine gesture that left Clara speechless. "Thank you for today," Emily said as they pulled apart. "Thank you," Clara replied, her voice filled with emotion. As Clara watched Emily walk away, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in decades. It wasn't perfect, and there was still work to be done, but they were finally moving forward. Together, the days following their walk in the park were filled with cautious optimism for both Clara and Emily. Their conversations had grown more frequent, short phone calls and text messages that were light and unforced. Though the road to full reconciliation was still ahead, they were taking steady steps toward each other. The turning point came when Emily sent Clara a text late one evening. "Emily, Dad, and I are planning a small family dinner next weekend. I think it's time for all of us to sit down together and talk. Really talk. Are you in?" Clara's heart leapt as she read the message. It wasn't just another invitation. It was an opportunity, a chance to solidify the progress they had made and take a step closer to becoming a family again. That Saturday evening, Clara arrived at James's house carrying a bouquet of fresh flowers and a bottle of wine. The house looked the same as it had during her last visit, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, there was a sense of possibility in the air. Emily opened the door, smiling softly. "Hey, Mom, come on in." "Hi." "Emily," Clara said, handing her the flowers. "These are for you." Emily accepted them with a nod, her fingers brushing against the petals. "Thanks. They're beautiful." Inside, the table was already set, the warm glow of candlelight giving the room a cozy atmosphere. James was in the kitchen, his familiar presence grounding the space. "Clara," he said, glancing over his shoulder as she entered. "Glad you could make it." "Thanks for having me," Clara replied, her tone sincere as they sat down to dinner. The conversation began with polite small talk. They discussed work, the changing seasons, and neighborhood gossip, keeping the atmosphere light. But as the meal progressed, Emily cleared her throat and set her fork down, her expression serious. "I think it's time we address the elephant in the room," she said, looking between her parents. James nodded, his gaze steady. "Agreed." Clara's hands tightened around her napkin, but she met Emily's eyes. "I'm ready if you are." Emily took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about what it means to forgive someone, and what it means to move forward. And I realize that I don't want to carry this weight anymore. I don't want to live my life defined by anger or resentment." Clara's heart ached at her daughter's words, but she stayed quiet, letting Emily continue. "You hurt me," Emily said, her voice trembling slightly. "You hurt Dad too, but I also know now that you were hurting and that you were scared. I don't think I'll ever fully understand why you made the choices you did, But I'm starting to see that you didn't stop loving us." Clara's voice was thick with emotion as she replied, "I never stopped, Emily. Not for a single moment." Emily nodded, her eyes glistening. "I believe you, and I want us to try, to rebuild something, even if it's not perfect." Clara reached across the table, her hand hovering for a moment before Emily took it. "I will spend the rest of my life making this up to you," Clara said softly. "You don't have to make it up to me," Emily replied. "You just have to show me that you're here, that you're not going anywhere this time." "I'm here," Clara said, her voice steady. "And I'm not going anywhere." James watched the exchange in silence, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he spoke. "You know, Clara, I wasn't sure we'd ever get to this point, but seeing the way Emily has opened herself to this, I think it's time I let go of my own anger too." Clara turned to him, her eyes wide. "James, He held up a hand. "Let me finish. I spent years blaming you for everything that went wrong. But the truth is, we both made choices, and we both paid for them in our own ways. I see now that you're trying, and that means something, so, for Emily's sake, and for all of ours, I think it's time to move forward." Tears streamed down Clara's face as she nodded. "Thank you, James. That means more than I can say." After dinner, they moved to the living room, where James poured glasses of wine for the adults and tea for Emily. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, and for the first time, laughter filled the room. They shared stories from Emily's childhood, memories that made them smile and ache in equal measure. As the evening wound down, Emily pulled out her phone and set it on the coffee table. "I have something to show you both," she said, pulling up a slideshow of photos from her childhood. The images played on the screen. Emily at her first soccer game, grinning with a missing tooth. Emily blowing out birthday candles. Emily and James sitting on a picnic blanket at the park. Clara's heart swelled as she watched the slideshow. "You've had such a beautiful life," she said quietly. "I did," Emily replied, "and I think it can be even better if we let it." Clara looked at her daughter, her chest tightening with emotion. "I think so too." As the night came to an end, Clara hugged Emily tightly at the door. "Thank you," Clara whispered. "For everything." Emily smiled, her eyes warm. "We're getting there, Mom. One step at a time." Clara nodded, her heart full. One step at a time. As she walked to her car, Clara felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She glanced back at the house, its lights glowing warmly against the night. For the first time, it felt like home. Weeks later, the three of them found themselves at the same cafe where it had all started, over coffee and pastries. They talked and laughed, the weight of the past finally lifting. As they left the cafe, Emily slipped her hand into Clara's. A small but powerful gesture. Clara smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. They weren't perfect, but they were a family, and that, Clara realized, was all she had ever wanted.